This is Emily Hull with the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program at Oklahoma State. Today is Thursday, April 5th, 2018, and I'm at the Scissortail Literary Festival in Ada, Oklahoma, interviewing Gay Pasley for the Deep Roots Oklahoma Authors Oral History Project. Gay, you're an author, an award-winning community leader, photographer, and a professional nurse. Thanks for taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you.
Where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born in Antigua, St. John's, Antigua, which was at that time considered part of the British West Indies, to a Black American father and an Antiguan mother. Mm-hmm. They married about a month after I was born and brought me to the United States. I celebrated my first birthday in the U.S. in Oklahoma.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I've grown up here.
Mm-hmm. Did you ever go back and visit?
Actually, we went back a few times when I was a child. Because we were Midwest, most of the people who immigrated to the U.S. would go to New York or California, and the flights were much cheaper, much more affordable. And so we didn't have the opportunity to go back as often. But I have incredible memories of my great-grandparents and my great-aunts and cousins. And actually, after, I would say, maybe 35 years, for the first time, I went back 3 years ago.
Oh, really?
Right. We had, my grandmother is the only living child of my grandparents. And we took her back for a family reunion. And I got to go back and meet family, and it was a beautiful, beautiful experience.
Yeah. What's it like there?
Well, I would encourage you to read some of Jamaica Kincaid's work. Jamaica Kincaid is from Antigua. Very controversial in Antigua. Ironically, she wrote a poem called Girl. And although it had been years since I had stepped foot in Antigua, and the last time was as a child, everything that she talked about, I knew because of hearing my mother and grandmother and godmother who had immigrated here. So I was familiar with the terms, I could understand the language, and to me it was beautiful. It was beautiful. Right.
So you grew up in Oklahoma in Tulsa?
I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Okay. Right. When my father again was from the United States, but he was from Florida, and he was a world-traveled man. He grew up very poor, was a self-taught saxophonist, and somehow ended up in Antigua, where he met my mother. But he was in the military and was very interested and talented in terms of mechanics. And he went to a school, Spartan School of Aeronautics. And once there, he moved, when they moved here, they couldn't find anybody to rent to them because they were Black. When they talked to him on the phone, they said yes, but then they found out that they were Black. And so we moved further and further into North Tulsa, and that's where we ended up settling.
Okay.
Yes.
What do you remember about the neighborhood in North Tulsa?
Okay. Well, it's called Suburban Acres.
Yes.
And it was a, if I had to look back, I would say a tight-knit community. We are still friends with many of the people that I grew up with. The Gaines family lived down the street. The next door neighbors, we have this lingo that we use in Oklahoma. So it was the twins and them, and it was Tanya and them, and that represented an entire family of children. One child usually got the recognition, but it was beautiful. It was grassy. We would go to the creek down the street and catch crawdads. We would July 4th. I remember lighting firecrackers with my friends. There were blackberries. We would walk and pick wild blackberries, what have you. There was Chamberlain Park, which is behind my parents' home, and that's where we learned how to swim.
Mm-hmm.
And so those are some of the memories that I have. Right.
How's Tulsa changed over the years, and maybe how has it stayed?
It's an interesting question. So when I grew up in North Tulsa, it was very obvious that there was a racial divide. The blacks lived on the north side, the whites lived on the south side, and there were very few Hispanics. I remember in school, I went to Holy Family, and I remember the first time a Vietnamese family came into the school, and it was the Nguyen family. And so there wasn't a lot of diversity. Tulsa's very green, it's very beautiful. What have you. But it was very rare to see, when we did see white people coming into North Tulsa, it was usually church groups. And they would set up camps in the field across the street from my house and, play soccer with us and things like that. And those are things that we look forward to in the summer. Ironically, when I go back to North Tulsa, and we would walk to the store. We would get penny candy. It's making me feel really old now because I thought it would always be that way. Yeah. And it's not necessarily. I perceive Tulsa, North Tulsa, as my home, as my village. I perceive it as a beautiful place to live. But quite often I hear about increased crime rates. I see that the neighborhood, whereas you never saw any white families, I do see white families in the neighborhoods in North Tulsa now, and there's even a Hispanic family that lives down the street, and so those were some of the changes. But I would have to say that there is still that racial line of segregation there that exists.
So you told me a little bit about your parents. Can you tell me a little bit more about them? What were they like? What were their personalities like? You have siblings?
I do. My father had a very traumatic childhood. His father was very abusive to his mother. He literally had night terrors. Post-traumatic stress syndrome is what I would say. He was an alcoholic, very violent. I don't remember many holidays when the police didn't come to our house. So my father was very haunted from his upbringing. He was the oldest child to a teenage mom, and I remember him telling stories about his father. I've actually written about it. But my father loved animals, and he had a pet dog, a dog. And at one time, my grandfather, who was very violent, went towards him or yelled at him, and the dog barked, and my grandfather shot the dog. He tells stories about seeing his mother get shot, and the bullet was lodged in her neck until she died, and how the family was separated. Family members took, all the children in. There were several boys and one girl who, that because of that, as a result, you'll see our last name spelled differently, because when the families took them in, they didn't know how to spell their name. So you'll see Pasley spelled with an I. Yeah. You'll see it, Paseley, and as I spell it, Pasley. So my mother grew up in the islands. She was born to a single mother. Another dramatic story. Yeah. She was another essay that I've written. She was in love with someone who had broken her heart, and she would show him, and she met my father on the beach, and I believe I was conceived that night. And so brought to the U.S., but my grandmother soon came to be with us afterwards, and my godmother had a because I was considered a bastard, my parents weren't married, I was baptized. I couldn't be baptized on a Sunday. I had to be baptized on a Wednesday, and I required more godparents. And so there's this list of names. And I would say that I have met in my lifetime, there are only two godmothers who are still, no, three godmothers that are still alive. And I've met every single last one of them, and they're beautiful, and they stay in touch, and they take being a godmother very seriously. So Ethelyn is my godmother, and just love her to death. She now lives next door to my mother.
Oh, really?
And ironically, even in the islands, the family would live next to one another. And so I see them replaying that, and there's a fence in between the homes, and, they could just go, walk down the side, but they choose to walk across the grass to one of another's homes and visit. So.
And siblings, brothers, and sisters?
I have a younger brother, John L. Pasley, who's in the military. He's retired military. And then I have a sister, Stephanie Brown. She is my father's daughter. And another brother, Eric, who I've never met, but who I've been told about.
What were you like as a child? What were your hobbies? What did you like to do for fun?
I think I was a very sensitive child. It was very difficult living in Oklahoma with a mother who talked funny. And so I would get teased quite often. I felt different. I didn't know what that was. At that time, to be lighter complected and to have long hair was to be beautiful. And so I did not possess those traits. I was darker complected. I had short hair. And so I was introverted. I had a hard time learning. And so there were teachers. My mother took us out of public schools. One, because in the islands, it was colonized by the British, and so she was accustomed to, uniforms and things like that. But there was an experience that she had early on. I was very bow-legged, and a teacher had said to her, well, if I had known you knew this person, I would have helped you get, that we had a program, and I could have helped you get braces for her legs. And she felt that because she was not from the area, they excluded her. And so she wanted to level the playing field. And so we went to private schools. And what I've discovered as I've begun to write and found other writers with similar backgrounds, Caribbean heritage, like, for example, Claudine Rankin. She talks about the fact that she went to private school too. And as I bump into other people from the Caribbean, they too, attended private Catholic schools as well. So, yeah.
What was your favorite subject?
I don't know that I had a favorite subject. I do know that I absolutely hated math and did not do well with it. And that just because of the violence that we grew up with, we don't know if it was the violence or if it was truly a learning disability, but my brother and I always required extra support, tutoring, what have you. So I would actually have to go to the white bus, and I couldn't remember things. Like the teacher would say something and they might even be standing right over me, but my memory would miss me. And I, just had a really difficult time with that. And so, people are, when my classmates see me now, they're really, I didn't find out that it was actually a learning disability until after I graduated from school, college. I had to learn how to teach myself, and they kept saying, but she's so smart to struggle like this. We don't understand what's going on. And lots of times when people see me on TV or doing interviews or writing, they're really surprised. It's like, oh my God, we went to school with her. It's like they're surprised I can get out of bed. But, how you like me now? Yeah. Sorry.
That's right. I like that.
And what's interesting is that what they call it is dyscalculia. I have a difficult time tracking. And so although I'm a writer, I type my words backwards sometimes, quite often. And if you, only people who work with me for a while, they get to, it's almost as though it's a different language. And then I have to go back and convert that. And I always have to work with a copy editor to make sure. But I usually use the paper as a blank slate, and I put the information, it's like a palette, and you just throw it on there and then form it to tell your story. And it shapes my voice as well. So
yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
So what did you dream about becoming as a child? What led you to
Well, my
study?
father was very focused on the fact, he and his brothers were very competitive, and everybody wanted to have the first college graduate, the first doctor. And so he, Gay, you could be the first doctor in the family, And he bought me a kit, a nursing, well, it was a kit, a medical kit. And, he was an alcoholic, so he was always bumping himself. And so he was my first patient, literally. And, I didn't know what to do other than throw alcohol on it and a Band-Aid. And he took it, He's like, oh, come on, Gay, help me, I'm bleeding. And so he was my first patient. But with that particular kit, I remember looking at it. And on the kit, there was a white patient, a white nurse, and a white physician. The only female that I saw was the nurse, because that's, stereotypically what you would expect. There was no one that was Black. And so I didn't identify with anybody but the nurse. And then somehow I became impassioned with becoming a nurse, and I would check out from the library every 2 weeks. So you want to be a nurse, and I put my dolls in boxes, and I would have hospitals, and I was going to be a nun. I was Sister Gay. I would tie my sweater, cardigan sweater, and button it down the back, and I was a nun. But ironically, there was a nun named Sister Sienna Marie at Holy Family, who worked with me diligently. I was extremely shy. And she said there was a essay or a writing contest, and I wrote a story about snowflakes and God. And she told my mother I was going to be a writer. But we didn't know any writers, know, and so it wasn't a path that, nobody knew how to tell me how to go down that path. And so nursing was the logical thing to do, because the nurses made more money, what have you. So that's what happened.
Yeah. So you studied nursing in college?
I did. I actually, at Votech in Tulsa, took a health careers class. I started working as a housekeeper and then a nurse assistant. I went to Central State University in Edmond, Oklahoma, where I flunked out with a 1.2 GPA. And again, this is when we don't know that I have a learning disability. I went to the military as a combat medic or medical specialist. Got back home and was pregnant and delivered my first daughter, and realized that I could not provide for her the way I wanted to on a nurse assistant salary. So I literally took her to my mother and grandmother. I got her out of the intensive care unit, took her to my mother and grandmother, and I figured, okay, this is the challenge. You're going to have to figure this out. And so I took the basic classes. I started all over, and eventually I was able to graduate from nursing school.
So do you remember your first nursing job?
My first nursing job was at Hillcrest Medical Center, and I worked in labor and delivery. They actually remembered me from when I had delivered my daughter. It was a pretty traumatic delivery. I did not have a lot of support. My family was very disappointed. They had brought me to the United States, and I had become a statistic, a single Black mom. And so, I didn't have classes. All I was told was that birth hurt. I had no idea what that meant. And with each contraction, I literally screamed and cursed. I didn't know what to expect. Ironically, it ended up being a gift in that once I became a nurse, and I started working in that area, I started to notice discrepancies with birth outcomes. And it was low-income women and women of color who did not know when to come to the hospital. There were old wives' tales, things like that. And because of my experience in seeing this, I created an organization. I conducted a needs assessment, created an organization called BirthWorks Prenatal, and taught prenatal education to low-income families in North Tulsa. The organization was funded by the March of Dimes, the Ann and Henry Zarrow Foundation, and the United Way. I taught myself how to write grants, and we ended up having a 5K run annually, and it was a very successful program. And then eventually, I was not able to continue to work 3 jobs and run a charitable organization and and be a mom, and so it dissolved. But ironically, every once in a while, my mom will say, there's somebody called and they were hoping that BirthWorks was still open because there's a need. North Tulsa has one of the highest infant mortality rates. I'm going to say in the world, if I'm not, or in the U.S., but certainly for Oklahoma, the birth outcomes in North Tulsa are devastating.
I know every birth is a story, but was there a particular patient that you worked with that really was hard to forget for whatever reason?
There's so many.
Yeah, I know that's hard.
There was a beautiful soul. She was a teenage mother who came to the classes that I had created. And what I had noticed about the childbirth classes that were in existence is that they existed for married couples. But for a single mother, who is your support? It might be one of your best friends that comes to class with you. It might be your mother. And that, sometimes they were uncomfortable sitting in those areas with married people. And so I made it open. And I remember that this young woman, I would teach about kick counts. And she came to me and she said, last week you taught us about kick counts. And she said, I haven't felt my baby move in 7 days. And I said, are you sure? And she said, yes. And so I said, I want you to have some, have a seat, let's see. And I felt her abdomen, and we were at Moton Clinic at that time. And I listened with the Doppler, and I didn't hear anything. I just heard her heartbeat. And so I told her that I thought that she needed to go to the hospital. And apparently when she went, it was confirmed that the baby was stillborn and had, and based on what the other nurses had told me, it had probably been stillborn for a while, and that they thought that we'd actually probably saved her life because she was becoming infected. Sometimes they didn't recognize when to go to the hospital, what have you. There's just a number of things, but she's one that has stayed with me. She's one that stayed with me. I actually have several who will find me on social media and say, okay, my child is 18 years old now, and you encouraged me. And it's like, I don't remember that, but it's beautiful to get those messages and to see those children doing well and prospering.
So you worked as a delivery nurse for a while, and then you also worked as a hospice?
I've done a number of things.
I
was actually one of the first sexual assault nurse examiners with Tulsa. We had, it was called an organization called OOHRP, and I collaborated with the organization as well as the Tulsa Police Department to try to gain the trust of the North Tulsa community. And so we would do just all kinds of projects. Recognize the Good Neighbor Award was something that I had implemented so that when you saw crime, you reported it, and you knew that you were going to be safe and not have any issues with retaliation, what have you. And so that's actually why I won the Tulsa Paragon Award. It was my work with OOHRP. I never thought I would end up doing hospice nursing.
Yeah.
And, by some fluke, I ended up working for a hospice, and I've done that for the last 10 years. And so that's been there's a lot of parallels between giving birth and the dying process and prepping. And so.
Yeah, could you explain those parallels?
Well, everybody experiences birth differently, and everybody experiences death differently. And so when I talk about the parallels, you can have a protracted labor, you can have a protracted death, you can have an abrupt labor, you can have an abrupt death. It just kind of depends on the disease process. And as you walk families through that, you just kind of have to, this is the trajectory that I'm seeing, when to expect what, when to provide the education so that they are they're able to absorb it, what have you. So
are you still in nursing, or have you
Actually, I am still in nursing. Okay. I am. It's been a little interesting. I recently resolved a case with a former employer regarding what I consider to be, or what I coined, a term that I coined called patient-initiated, employer-sponsored race bias. Mm-hmm. And that is when a patient comes into a healthcare facility and demands a health professional, a health professional of a certain race or culture. And so oftentimes it's someone saying, I don't want a Black nurse. And that was my experience. And I had experienced it multiple times in my career. And I thought it was the norm. I thought it, a patient says this and this is what you do, And the first time I experienced it was probably within my first year of nursing. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know what to say. I didn't, know what my rights were. And it has continued to happen throughout my nursing career. And with the current political climate, I decided no more. It's painful having 26 years of nursing experience and then being the most experienced nurse in the room, and then being reduced to the Black chambermaid and watching your employer create an all-white staff. And so I have started speaking publicly about it, and plan to continue to do some research regarding, I had made a comment about my experience. I said that the nursing supervisor came to me and said, that patient said he don't want no Black people in his house. And I said, did you tell him I worked for the company? Yeah. Did you tell him what my credentials were? Did you tell him that I had passed every test? Did you tell him that I was your most experienced nurse? Did you tell him anything? And she's like, no, you just can't go. And she believed that was the right thing to do. And so when I shared that story, I was really surprised at the number of health professionals of color. There was not one who had not experienced it. And if I had to guess, I haven't started gathering the actual statistics yet, mm-hmm. but within the first 1 to 2 years of nursing, you experience it. And or of working in the health profession, if you are a health professional of color, you will experience that. And oftentimes you just go to your supervisor and you're waiting on the nurse supervisor to make a decision. And I think oftentimes the majority of people, I was really surprised that the majority of healthcare professionals, even of color, we say, if that patient doesn't want me, then I just won't go. And we rationalize it. Yeah. Or we think, the patient has that right. The patient has the right to competent health care. They don't have the right to come into your workplace and discriminate against you. And so educating the community telling our stories. I'd very much like to do something similar to this with the photo documentaries and talk about nurses' experiences and why they chose to make the decisions that they did versus standing. Standing is very difficult. Saying, I'm sorry, I'm competent and able to care for you is very difficult. And I compare it to moving to the back of the bus. What are the reasons why? We know that there were some people who were just adamant that I'm not going to go to the back of the bus just because, you tell me because I'm Black and that's my designated place. And, you don't want to deal with a racist that day. You're concerned about lawsuits. Sometimes there's the threat of being told that it's battery if you touch that person. But that's, it's all misinformation. And that practice is considered a Jim Crow era practice, secret of the healthcare community that still exists.
And you've written about this.
I have, actually, I think what you're referring to is the essay, Any, Meeny, Miny, Mo, where I parallel two experiences that I had. One in my early nursing career, where I had labored with a young mother. The family was absolutely beautiful and stayed past my shift to ensure that this baby was going to be healthy. And as the elderly grandmother came into the room, and I try to bring the family in, and she starts to tell this nursery rhyme, and it's eeny, meeny, miny, mo. And I'm holding the oxygen to this baby's face, and she says, catch a nigger by his toe. And I'm totally floored. I had never heard the nursery rhyme told that way. And then I had another experience in nursing where I had a patient who was, I had been told that she was dying. And I went to the home. And oftentimes in hospice, you'll just, when their patients are so chronically ill, they're no longer able to get up and walk to the door. And so you just let yourself in. And I go down these winded, narrow-minded hallways is what I called it. And the son got up to leave. And oftentimes there's the misunderstanding that hospice is there and we're going to move in and we're going to take care of your family member. And I was like, no, you can't go. And I started to explain to him the hospice policies. And his mother said, son, do we need to take this nigger back behind the woodshed? And so I write about that in this experience and connecting those dots and those experiences. I have actually written an essay called Terminal Agitation. And terminal agitation is something that you see as people sometimes are dying and they can become combative. I believe it's part of the anxiety and pain cycle, but it's almost a refusal to die. They're not able to let go. And I talk about the experience with patient-initiated, employer-sponsored race bias in that, and I'm looking for a home for that particular essay.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. So tell me about earning your MFA.
Okay, so I mentioned that there was a book called Without Sanctuary, and it is a there were two gentlemen, if I remember correctly. They lived in California, and they would go to garage sales, and as people's family members would die, they sold everything, including postcards. And they started to notice these lynch postcards, and they began to collect them. And in this book, there is one picture of a woman and her son, Mary Laura Nelson, and her son LD, who were lynched. The majority of the pictures in the book, they take the first opportunity that they can. And the lynchings took place from trees or from lampposts. But from this particular image, it was on a bridge. And the community gathered on the bridge the next day to have their pictures taken with the bodies. Woody Guthrie's father attended the lynching and gave him firsthand account of what happened. And he actually wrote 3 songs about the lynching that I used as clues in finding in my research. For example, if you look at that photograph, there, you see, of course, the people from Okemah, Oklahoma, dressed in their Sunday best, and you see these 2 bodies. This was around the first time I picked up my camera, and I wasn't really skilled, but immediately my perspective was, oh my gosh, that poor photographer just happened to be walking around and caught this picture. Yeah. And as, I thought it was going to be something that, I'll write in a month or something. I was a new writer. And I, started penning. And then with my writing, so has my photography grown. And I realized, oh my gosh, this photographer had something to do with the placement of these bodies. This is a staged shoot. The bodies reflect beautifully off the water. I mean, it's a gruesome scene, but it is very picturesque. And the majority of lynch postcards, there are a few where the photographer might sign their name. But very rarely do they sign, date, and number. And growing up in North Tulsa, there was a art store called Future Vision. And the owner, I was a single mom, and I mean, she had this beautiful artwork, James Denmark, and all these beautiful African and African-American artists were there. And she would invite me in, and she would teach me about signed and numbered pieces. And this is before I ever encountered the postcard. And so when I saw that postcard, I knew this is something different. Everything, all of them are tragic, but this one was intended as an art piece. And that particular photographer, Farnham, G.H. Farnham, was a photographer in Oklahoma at statehood. He took incredible photos, and they are at our Oklahoma Historical Library. I have actually interviewed his family and, gathered information about him. And they have absolutely no problem talking to you about that and giving information. So I've stayed in touch with them. So
did this kind of serve as the basis of your thesis? Or
actually, it was, I had to tell her story.
Yeah.
And so that's what kind of switched me into writing. And I went to an Oklahoma Writers Federation conference, and I was prepared to pitch this first draft of writing, and I had never written before. And it is there that I met Janetta Calhoun-Mish, who is now our poet laureate. And I pitched to her, and I didn't hear from her for a year. And then, but I had actually pitched to another agent who had written back to me, which was really, now I realize it was impressive. She wrote back to me and said, if you can write this way, we have never seen anybody thoroughly research a project like this and resubmit to me. I would like to look at it. And her name was Louise Furry. And I said, I'll get back with you in 6 months. I had no idea how to write a book. And so around that time, Janetta sent me an email regarding, she had started doing writing workshops at the Ralph Ellison Library in Oklahoma City. And I was invited, and I went. And that's when I started getting writing prompts. But when I met Janetta at the Oklahoma Writers Federation, she said, well, do you know any writers? Who do you hang out with? I was like, no. She's like, well, what do you read? Nursing textbooks. And so she was literally my introduction. I consider her my mother in the literary community. She was my introduction. She said, don't ever throw away anything. And I stuck with it. At some point, she became the director of the Oklahoma City University Red Earth MFA program. And I applied, and I didn't get in the first time.
Oh, no.
I didn't. Oh, it was embarrassing. It was embarrassing because I was embarrassed because I knew I had a disability. I couldn't type. And so to go into these white spaces and have this, to appear competent and know that I had these shortcomings. And so I would continue to go to these workshops, and I would pick up other people that I could see were interested and were serious about their writing. And we created what we call Deep Deuce Writing Society. We named it after the area that Ralph Ellison grew up in. And so my focus was always to write this story about Mary Laura Nelson. And so to be here today and see it, it was actually published in Transitions, which is affiliated with Harvard University. And just very proud of the fact that I can, as I say, put respect on the Nelson family name.
Yeah, it's, and I was here at your reading, so to hear you talk about it now and see you present it in such a public space, it's just
thank you.
It's a really neat thing. There was something you wrote in that essay in the final paragraph that I think is just a really interesting concept or thought. Where you were writing about your conversation with, he was a retired detective.
Right, he was a retired law enforcement.
Where you were, and just to remind people who may be listening to this oral history, remind us who that person was in your.
I can't say his name just because
Mr. Lawman.
Okay, yeah. So I refer to him as Mr. Lawman, and so as I became obsessed, I actually carried the book around with me for months, and then I photocopied the image, and it was always with me. And I found myself at the Oklahoma Historical Library, just researching. Every loophole, every rabbit hole, trail that I could find. And I have always befriended librarians. I've just never met a librarian I didn't like. And one of the librarians, I was asking, at this point I'm asking about the law enforcement officials that were involved in the murder of the family. And he said, there's this guy that has this organization, and I think you should go and talk to him. And he gave me his phone number. And I called. And like I say in my essay, at first I didn't get a response, and I didn't think a lot about it. But then he continued to call me once a week, sometimes twice a week, to remind me that I had initiated the call. And, I don't know, can I give away what I said? Or
what I was going to ask you about was just, and I think we can just talk about this in general, but you wrote that he should be cured of his distortion, his inversion of truth. I think just the concept of inversion of truth is really interesting.
Okay, and so where that stems from is from photography.
Okay.
The fact that they photographed this murder, and that it's not unnerving to him. It is natural to him to eat in a restaurant with the pictures of dead bodies on the wall. And, at some point, I talk about the fact that he became very comfortable with me on the phone. He didn't recognize that part of my passion was because of who I am, and that's why I was researching this. And so he confirms, so he thinks, and it was totally unexpected. Yeah. I was blown away. He didn't realize that I was Black. And he said, let me tell you something about, and actually his direct quote was, let me tell you something about niggas and Mexicans. And my silence, I'm waiting on him to say something. What can you possibly tell me that justifies this? And my silence alerted him. And he said, this doesn't interest me. And I'm thinking, how can a woman and child hung from a bridge not interest you? And, oftentimes, as I started the research, there was this consistent story. And no matter what, I think it's important that people realize, even if they had stolen something, we have a judicial system.
Right.
Hanging them is not justified. And, as much as we think that lynching is gone, it's now state-sanctioned murder with guns. Mm-hmm. And in that particular essay, I tried to make those parallels. But when I talked about the fact that he should be cured of his phantasmagoria, that all has to do with the camera and your vision and how you see things. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted him to know the truth. And I wanted to show him the documents that proved that this family was innocent. He invites me to a gun show.
Can't make this stuff up,
I
right?
can't make this stuff up.
The thing about nonfiction.
Right.
Writing. Let's see. So let's talk about your writing process as a creative nonfiction writer. Mm-hmm. Do you write short stories as well? Do you write poetry? Or?
So my poetry, what is one person's poem is another person's flash essay.
There's fine.
And so I write nonfiction. I have not dwelled into fiction. I'm astounded by the mind of the fiction writer. I thought that that's what I was going to do, but my professors, they kept saying, "Kay, you've had such an interesting and fascinating life. Yeah. We need you to focus on nonfiction." And so that's where my words and my stories lie. My process, I talked a bit about having learning differently. Yeah. And so sometimes, there's this joke, I write like Satan. I can't read my own writing. I write backwards. I type backwards sometimes. And so rather than focus on that, I look at the page as a blank canvas, and I put my words there, and I form them, and I shape them, and I mold them. Mm-hmm. I have found that it is easier for me, an idea or concept will come into my mind, or words, or pictures, and if I speak it into a microphone, I usually have about half a page, mm-hmm. or it gives me a good direction. And now the words type out for you. Yeah. And so then I can go back in and mold it to what I needed to be and to tell the story that I want to tell.
Do you show your early drafts to your peers in your writing group?
I am just now getting to the point. No, I wouldn't. I'm now starting to think, I haven't gotten to the point where I'm comfortable with showing people that part of me. Yeah. I'm just now getting to the point where I'm even recognizing that, instead of typing the, I'm always typing etc. It should be the, and I have to go back and correct that. I'm now starting to think of how I can use that in a story, because you can still read it. Yeah. It just, and turn that into some type of art or what have you. But no, I usually will, it's work, it's not something that you just sit down and you just write one draft. You have to tend it like a baby. You pay attention to those every sentence. And so I spend a lot of time with finding meaning and layering the story, what have you. And sometimes I just write and then it's there. And you're like, how did that get there? But it's there. Yeah. So
how do you know when to keep pursuing a project or when to let it go?
That's a great question. I don't know that I will ever let the Nelson family go. Yeah. Several years ago, I went to, just on another fluke, we go down to the Vital Statistics office and see if I can get any information about this family. And, I paid the fees, and I gave them the names of Mary Laura Nelson and LD and Carrie, and we don't know the name of the newborn. And the only death report that they turned up was Mary Laura Nelson. And so I thought, well, that's weird. Why would they not have one for LD or Carrie? And several years later, and they said, no, there's nothing. We looked entirely. And several years later, I went back and they were able to produce LD's death report. And so I now, so this has literally been since 2000 when that book was first published, and I continue to find new evidence regarding them. So I don't know that I will ever completely be done, and sometimes there will be something that kind of stirs in me that says, go look here. And right now things have kind of switched to, I mentioned researching or what I consider working class studies, or what Janetta has taught me are working class studies, to tell the stories of nurses of color in America. So,
what's a productive writing day look like for you? You're so busy with so many things. So.
Well, I have to, because I'm a nonfiction writer, I've had to learn that I have to stop beating myself up, because if I'm living, I'm writing. If I'm experiencing, I'm writing. And I just have to make sure that I jot down those things. And so I have to capture it. Don't let it get away. And so I'm just making sure. I mean, I literally will fall asleep with a pencil or pen in my hand. and as a writer, maybe you know that too. Yeah. Ink stains on your bed sheets.
Yeah. Do you do voice notes? Or
I do voice
like
notes as well.
Yeah.
I do voice notes as well. And that's my process. And then I mold and shape. And at some point I get to the point where, okay, I think this is somebody where I can show it to someone. And then with Deep Deuce Writing Society, we will look. I also, my first publication, which was First Day of School, which was in Thread Literary Magazine, Ellen Blum Barish, we just connected, and she is also a writing coach. And so I was able to be open with her and tell her about my learning style and because she has had similar experiences. And so with her, she helps me get it to what I call fitted black dress.
Nice.
That's when they're ready to go. It's fitted black dress.
That's when you should send it out. Great.
Yes.
Let's see. Is there anything else that you're working on right now that you want to talk about? Any works in progress besides the two?
Well, those two, I've got an art exhibit that is coming, tapestry with Laura, and I'm sorry, I can't remember her last name right now. But I was actually interviewed on her podcast. It's Tapestry Podcast. And she uses a quote from Maya Angelou that says that we're all kind of a tapestry. And she has a diverse group of artists that she interviews on this podcast. And so she brings you in, and then you talk about, your process, how you got started. And then you can invite an artist that you respect to come in on the second podcast, and you do an interview. And I actually invited Janetta Calhoun Mish, who's the poet laureate, to come back in. But I am now working with photo montage. My earlier work was black and whites. And I am now working with photo montage. And Maintenance 11 was probably one of my, it's a Dada, one of the earliest Dada magazines that has been printed, and I was published, one of my images was published there, and that took me to being an international artist. And I just created another piece of work that's going to be published in the next, and I'm really excited about that, because for me it's Black Lives, it just says Black Lives Matter. And I made a play with Gulliver's Travels and gigantism, and so that's going to be released very soon. And so that's one of the pieces that I'll be showing. And I've created two other pieces. One will speak regarding gun violence in America. And the other piece is based off of an etching called The Venus de Sable of Angola, where they took, Venus is a Black woman, actually a slave, and she is led by Triton, with dolphins, what have you. And so I am adapting that to tell my story. So hers was Venus of Angola, of the West Indies. And so mine is the Venus of Angola, from the West Indies to the Americas. And I'm going to parallel that with my with an essay about my birth story and how I ended up here.
Great. To keep my eyes out for that.
Please do. Thank you.
So I came across this quote from you where you said, I've been planted and grown beautifully in the red dirt that Oklahoma so generously offers.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me more about
Well,
that?
in Oklahoma, as we know, red dirt abounds. It's something that is characteristic of our land. Growing up in North Tulsa, you were not considered successful unless you left Oklahoma. And so many people in my age group, in order to be considered as successful or as something, you had to move to New York or Florida or California or something like that. But I always felt like I needed to stay. Like you hear about people in war zones and you're like, well, how come they don't move? Why don't they just get up and flee? Yeah. And for me, I feel like I'm frontline in the battle. And so we need to, push up our sleeves, kick off our pumps, and do what we need to here, because it's easy to move someplace where you don't have those issues. But we have to have that voice. We have to stay here or we will forever be lost. I mean, the history of Oklahoma was supposed to be a liberal place where there wasn't, segregation and things of that sort. And they were literally tricked. And, then that's when they, started all these, rules and laws but Oklahoma originally, if you look at some of the images that existed, there were Black people, Native Americans, and white people in the same school. But once they got statehood, after they got that approval, the first law in the books was segregation. And that's when the separatism, started. And that's when we became this conservative red state. But that was not the original intent. And so when I say, for me, Janetta has a press, and it's called Mongol Empire Press. Mm-hmm. And I identified with being mongrel. I am both an immigrant and, my family, so immigrant from, my experience, but my father's family has been here since slavery. We've been a military family. And so to be able to grow in this hard red clay dirt, I call Oklahoma home, and this is where I am. I'm here to stay.
Great.
Thank you.
What's the best piece of writing advice you could give to other writers?
Would probably be a lot of the advice that Janetta gave me. Believe in yourself. Write to set yourself free. Write your truth. My entire thesis is named Blackbird, a Womanist Manifesto. And I named it after Nina Simone's song, Blackbird. And if you've ever heard it, the lyrics are depressing. But the way Nina Simone sings it, when she's talking about Blackbird, she's singing to, Black women, and although it's dire, because not only do you have the issue of color, or women of color, the issue of color, but you also have race. And she sings it as a challenge. And so for me, it was a womanist manifesto. And I wrote my truth. I wrote to set myself free. I wrote about other Blackbirds like Mary Laura Nelson and their experiences. And so.
Great. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
Not that I can think of.
Good. Thank you so much.
Thank you for interviewing
participating.
me. Okay.
Great.